This is a story of impossible odds, where rescue seemed out of reach, until the only option was to put him into an even more diresome predicament or face death. The option left was the riskiest one yet, gave a slim hope in the face of certain doom. At the start of the day, 16-year-old Andy Wernemont, his father Phil, and their two friends were filled with excitement and curiosity as they ventured into Skunk Cave. Equipped with only flashlights, they eagerly navigated the winding, shadowy passages. The air was thick and cool, carrying the scent of earth and rock. As they delved deeper, the narrow tunnels and jagged formations became more challenging, but the thrill of discovery kept them moving forward. For Andy, it was an adventure like no other. The atmosphere was a mix of excitement and caution as they pushed further into the cave's depths, unaware of the danger that lay ahead. An hour in, everything changed. The passage ahead angled sharply upward, drawing Andy's focus as he plotted his next move. In his eagerness to navigate the incline, he momentarily neglected to watch his footing. His gaze fixed on the path ahead, he failed to notice a crack forming beneath him, a vertical crevice hidden just before the entrance of the passage. This narrow gap was barely wide enough to fit even a small child. Andy slipped. In an instant, his body wedged itself into a narrow crevice about 250 feet from the entrance. The jagged stone scraped against his sides as he was wedged tightly, his body contorted at an awkward angle. The cave closed in around him, leaving only the faintest sliver of space to breathe. His chest heaved with every shallow breath and panic crept in. The crevice was narrow, barely wide enough to fit his shoulders, and the weight of the cold, crushing rock pressed against him like a vice. He was stuck, and there was no way he could move. His father, Phil, was only a few feet away, but might as well have been miles. Every attempt to free him only caused more pain, as the jagged edges of the rock dug deeper into his skin. His arms were pinned at odd angles, making any movement nearly impossible. His legs hung loosely, unable to find any solid ground to push off from, and the darkness around him felt suffocating. Despite his father's desperate efforts to pull him free, Andy remained trapped, unable to go forward or backward. The feeling of helplessness and isolation began to gnaw at him, his heart racing as the hours passed. With every failed attempt, the narrow crack seemed to tighten its grip, and the cave felt like it was swallowing him whole. As the cold air of the cave seeped into his bones, Andy's strength began to fade. Time seemed to blur, the darkness and pain becoming his only reality. His body, exhausted and beaten, started to give way to the creeping cold, and the threat of hypothermia loomed like a shadow. He was stuck, wedged in a place where no one could easily reach him, a place where the cave's ancient stones seemed determined to hold him forever. The panic in Andy's eyes mirrored Phil's growing desperation. "I can't reach him well enough," Phil shouted to the others. His voice was edged with fear. "We need help. Now." There was nothing more they could do. Andy barely had the strength to hold his face upwards for better breathing. The others, hearts pounding, rushed out of the cave to call for rescue. Time seemed to slow as they waited, the minutes dragging by like hours. By the time the first rescuers from the local fire department arrived, it was 1:30 p.m. More than 3 hours since Andy had first become trapped. As the rescuers assessed the situation, more help arrived. Experienced cavers from the Iowa Grotto filed into the cave, their faces set with determination. They studied the crevice, noting how Andy's body was positioned, how the cold stone seemed to refuse any attempt to free him. They placed boards beneath him, hoping to keep him from slipping any deeper. But even with hours of effort, they couldn't move him an inch. The hours ticked by. It was dark now, and the chill of the cave gnawed at Andy's bones. The rescuers worked tirelessly, but every failed attempt only deepened their concern. Andy was getting weaker. He had been trapped for nearly 12 hours, and the cold was starting to take its toll. Hypothermia was becoming a very real threat. Then John Ackerman arrived, a seasoned caver with a sharp mind and steady hands. He saw the weariness in the rescuer's eyes and the fear clinging to Andy's face. Something had to change. He approached Andy, crouching down next to him in the tight space. "We're going to get you out of here," he said, his voice calm but firm. But we need to try something different. Andy, covered in blankets and rescue gear, shivered as Ackerman removed the layers that obscured his view of the passage. Studying the crevice carefully, Ackerman realized that pulling Andy backward or forward wouldn't work. While deep thinking the solution, he came up with an idea that he believed would work. However, it came with risks. In order to set Andy free, Ackerman had to put the kid in an even more dire situation. By that time, it was their only option. They needed to go deeper into the crevice. He decided that if Andy could be lowered further into the crevice, it would be possible to pull him forward, then up and out of the passage. "I know it's scary," Ackerman said, his hand gently gripping Andy's wrist. "But trust me, if we can lower you just a little bit more, we can pull you forward and get you out." Andy hesitated. The idea of sinking deeper into the darkness was horrifying. But there was something about Ackerman's calm demeanor that gave him hope. Nodding, he agreed. With one hand gripping Andy's wrist and the other clutching the board beneath him, Ackerman prepared for the final push. Another rescuer took hold of the board from below. Slowly, carefully, they slid the board out from under Andy's body, allowing him to slip deeper into the crevice. For a moment, the cave was silent, save for the sound of their labored breathing. And then, with a final pull, Andy slid forward. The tension in the air snapped as Ackerman pulled him out of the crevice. It took only minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. Andy was free. His legs were shaky, but his determination was strong. Eager to leave the cave behind, he was quickly helped to his feet and escorted to the exit. After nearly 12 harrowing hours, Andy stepped out of the darkness and into the light, safe at last. Dave Robbins stared at the mouth of the cave with a mix of excitement and trepidation. He wasn't an experienced caver, but he'd spent the last week poring over maps of this cave system, determined to surprise his girlfriend, Emily, with a hidden birthday picnic. The idea was romantic. Take her deep into the caves, unveil a perfectly planned setup, and watch her face light up. She loved adventure, and he wanted to be her hero. His best friend, Juan Alvarez, knew about his plan. "Just be careful, man. These caves can be tricky," Juan had warned. But Dave had shrugged off his friend's concerns, confident that his preparations were sufficient. Now, standing alone at the cave's entrance, he felt a slight chill run down his spine, but he quickly brushed it off and stepped into the darkness. Armed with a headlamp, a printed map, and a small backpack filled with supplies, Dave navigated the initial, well-mapped sections with ease. The limestone walls glistened with moisture, and the air was cool and damp. He marked his path carefully, following the map's indications. However, in his enthusiasm and perhaps a bit of overconfidence, he missed a crucial turn. The caves were a labyrinth of twists and turns, and soon, Dave found himself in an unfamiliar section. The passages were narrower, and the map he held became useless. Panic began to creep in, but he forced himself to stay calm. He tried retracing his steps, but every turn seemed to lead him deeper into the uncharted territory. Hours passed. Dave's headlamp flickered. Exhaustion set in, and the cold began to seep through his bones, making him shiver uncontrollably. His breath came in ragged gasps, the damp air doing little to alleviate his rising anxiety. He knew the signs of hypothermia. He'd read about it while planning this trip, but experiencing it was another matter entirely. Meanwhile, outside the cave, Dave's family was growing worried. They hadn't heard from him all day, and as evening approached, their concern turned into panic. They contacted everyone they could think of, but no one had any idea where Dave might be. Finally, they called Juan. Juan remembered Dave's plan. He mentioned going to the caves. I thought he was joking. Without wasting a moment, Juan contacted the local police, who quickly organized a search party. When they arrived at the cave, they found Dave's bike parked outside, just as Juan had suspected. The search turned into a rescue operation. A team of local caving experts was called in. They knew the dangers of these caves better than anyone and were well equipped for a rescue mission. The team divided into 3 groups, each taking a different section of the mapped caves. Hours passed as they called out for Dave, their voices echoing through the cavernous halls. Dave, now weak and disoriented, heard distant voices. At first, he thought he was hallucinating, but as the calls grew louder, he mustered the strength to respond. His voice was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough. The rescue team honed in on his location, navigating the treacherous, unmapped passages with expert precision. When they found him, Dave was slumped against a damp wall, his breathing shallow and labored. The rescuers quickly assessed his condition, offering him small sips of water and a few bites of an energy bar to revive him. They wrapped him in a thermal blanket to combat the hypothermia and gently tied a rope around his waist. The journey back to the surface was slow and methodical. The narrow passages that had seemed claustrophobic and endless to Dave were now expertly navigated by the rescue team. With every step, Dave's strength waned, but the determination of his rescuers never faltered. They encouraged him, kept him talking, and ensured he stayed conscious. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they emerged from the cave into the cool night air. An ambulance was waiting, and Dave was rushed to the hospital, where he was treated for hypothermia and dehydration. Juan and Dave's family were there, their faces a mix of relief and worry. In the days that followed, Dave recovered fully. On 19th August 2008, a group of 8 Keevers entered the discovery entrance of Bigfoot Cave in California. They were a mix of experienced climbers and scouts. The group split into 2 teams, a scouting group, tasked with finding new passages, and a climbing group, focused on tackling the challenging routes within the Cthulhu Room, a section known for its tricky, yet doable, climbs. The climbing group, consisting of Greg Milano, John Lane, and a few others, chose a tall lead in the Cthulhu Room that promised an adventurous ascent. After hours of meticulous effort, they had just finished placing their 12th bolt, securing their climb for the final push. Greg and John, who had briefly separated from the scouting team, rejoined their climbing companions, ready to take on the next challenge. As Greg was perched on a large boulder, inspecting the area for the next move, he felt an unsettling shift beneath him. The ground, which had seemed stable moments before, began to tremble slightly. "Whoa! John, are you clear?" Greg called out, his voice laced with sudden concern. John, still adjusting his position nearby, responded quickly but with a hint of panic. No, I'm not clear." His words were barely out when the cave erupted with a deafening crash. The sound of shifting boulders and the agonized screams of both men filled the cavern, echoing off the walls in a terrifying cacophony. The entire group, scattered throughout the cave, heard the disaster unfold. Within moments, they converged on the scene, their hearts pounding as they feared the worst. What they found was a nightmare come to life. The floor and ceiling of the choke, a narrow passage filled with loose rocks, had collapsed simultaneously. Greg, who had been standing on a large boulder, had triggered the fall. The boulders beneath him had given way, sending John into a free fall of about 10 feet before he was violently pinned between the rocks below. John's left leg was crushed, trapped under a massive boulder, while another rock had rolled onto his chest, squeezing the breath from his lungs. The pain was indescribable, a relentless pressure that made every breath a struggle. He could feel the bones in his leg grinding together, and the weight on his chest made his vision blur with pain and panic. But somehow, against all odds, he managed to slither out from under the crushing weight of the boulders. His leg, however, was clearly broken, the bone shattered and useless. The group quickly assessed the situation, their minds racing to find a solution. They knew they had to get John out, but the journey to the entrance would be grueling, especially with his injury. With no professional rescue team nearby and time ticking away, they decided on a self-rescue attempt. Some members stayed close to John, offering whatever aid they could, while others scouted the easiest route back to the cave's entrance. The trek was slow and torturous. John, supported by his friends, hobbled through the dark, uneven passages of the cave. Every step sent fresh waves of pain through his shattered leg, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on, knowing that stopping was not an option. The cave had turned into a merciless maze, each shadow hiding another potential danger. Finally, after hours of painstaking progress, the group emerged from the cave at 1 a.m. Exhausted and battered, John managed to hobble out to the trailhead by the next morning. The relief of fresh air and open sky was overwhelming, but the pain in his leg was a constant reminder of the ordeal he had survived. X-rays at the hospital later revealed that John had broken his fibula, the smaller bone in the lower leg. Though the injury was serious, it could have been much worse. On April 7, 2008, Myhel, a 30-year-old adventurer, called his mother to share his plans for the day. Already an enthusiastic mountaineer, Myhel had recently developed a budding interest in caving, a passion that had sparked just a month earlier. That day, he was set to explore Oków National Park, situated about 10 miles north of Krakow in southern Poland. Despite being the smallest national park in the country, Oków is renowned for its breathtaking limestone hills formed during the Jurassic period. Locals affectionately refer to this stunning region as the Jura, celebrating it as some of the most beautiful land in Poland. The Jura boasts 220 known caves, with Oków alone housing 10 of them. Though Myhel had little practical experience in caving, he had spent the past month immersing himself in as much information as he could find about the activity. Reading about an activity and actually doing it are, of course, very different. Crucially, it didn't take much research for Myhel to learn something very important about Oków National Park. Caving there is strictly prohibited. Over the years, the caves have been frequent targets for robbers who remove fossils to sell, leading to the installation of barred grates over each cave entrance to keep people out. Unfortunately, these measures didn't always deter trespassers, and they certainly weren't going to stop Myhel, although in hindsight he really should have taken them more seriously. As April 7th turned into April 8th, Myhel's mother grew increasingly worried. She hadn't heard from him, and he wasn't answering his phone. He had promised to call when he got home from Oków, but that call never came. She thought perhaps he was so exhausted from the day that he simply went to bed and forgot. However, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Determined not to take any chances, she jumped into her car and drove to Oków to search for him. She quickly found his car upon arrival, but saw no indication of where he might have gone, though at least she had narrowed down the possibilities. At 12:45 a.m. on April 8th, she pulled out her cell phone and called the police to report Myhel missing. Authorities responded immediately, arriving at Myhel's car with a police dog. The dog quickly picked up a scent, but lost it just as fast. The police then contacted the Jura Group, a team specializing in mountain and cave rescues. The Jura Group arrived with 22 rescuers and 2 more dogs. The cave's mouth, just 8 feet, or 2.5 meters wide, is the roomiest section in its entire 230 feet, or 70-meter length. Around 4:30 that morning, the dogs led the Jura Group to the entrance of Saspowska Cave, located more than 65 feet or 20 meters above the valley floor. The dogs entered the cave, with the rescuers following closely behind. Inside, they found a chamber that sloped downward toward a barred grate. Upon reaching the cave, rescuers immediately spotted Myhel's backpack, keys, and the displaced grate. This discovery left little doubt that Myhel was still inside the cave. If he was trapped in the incredibly tight tunnel, rescuing him alive would be an extraordinarily difficult task. The tunnel in Saspowska Cave becomes progressively narrower the deeper you go, severely limiting the number of rescuers who can fit inside at any given time. Only the slimmest members of the Jura Group could even attempt to navigate the claustrophobic passageways. Even the smallest rescuers struggled immensely, especially at one particularly challenging obstruction. One member likened it to trying to squeeze under a small car. After several failed attempts to get past this obstruction, it became clear that they needed specialized equipment. The realization that they couldn't move beyond the narrow opening without it was deeply concerning. Considering Myhel was likely bigger than the smallest Jura Group member, if he had managed to squeeze past the narrowest points, he was indeed in dire trouble. Once the specialized tools arrived, rescuers used chisels to widen the tight openings. About 46 feet, 14 meters, from the cave entrance, they found Myhel's phone, watch, helmet, headlamp, and gloves. Next to these items, they discovered his feet. The situation was worse than they had imagined. Myhel was almost completely upside down, wedged in a section of the tunnel ominously known as the clamp. The first rescuer reached him around 8:20 a.m., nearly 4 hours after the dogs had led them to the cave. Calling out to Myhel yielded no response. The rescuer then pricked Myhel's foot with a knife, but there was no reaction. It wasn't until the rescuer grabbed Myhel's ankle to check his vitals that the grim reality set in. There was no pulse, his skin was cold, and his legs were stiff. Myhel had been dead long before his mother realized he hadn't returned. With his mother weeping in the valley below, the rescue effort shifted to a body recovery mission. Determined to free Myhel so his mother could give him a proper burial, the Jura group members worked in shifts using chisels to remove enough rock to extricate him from the crevice. The painstaking work took hours. After finally freeing him, they faced the challenge of navigating him through the main tunnel, which was so narrow that only one rescuer could pull at a time. Being held upside down for an extended period causes gravity to pool blood in the head, forcing the heart to pump harder. The weight of the organs presses down on the lungs, preventing them from inflating properly. To pass through an obstruction like the clamp, Myhel likely had to make himself as small as possible by completely exhaling to empty his lungs. This technique can either allow a caver to advance or, as in Myhel's tragic case, leave them stuck indefinitely. Myhel's body was not autopsied, so the exact cause of his death remains unknown. However, it is believed he likely succumbed to either hypothermia or positional asphyxia. In the remote reaches of the Appalachian Mountains lies a cave known only to a few seasoned cavers. It had no official name, just whispered rumors among the local adventurers. They called it the Devil's Throat, but what started as a daring adventure for 4 friends would soon turn into an unimaginable tragedy. 4 lifelong friends set out to conquer the Devil's Throat. Leading the group was Jonathan John Mallory, a 32-year-old geologist who had spent years mapping caves across the country. Beside him was his best friend Peter Lawson, joined by Jensen Hart and Kevin Lazaro. They had heard stories of the cave's treacherous nature, but were not that concerned. After asking the route from the locals, they made their way towards the cave. The sun was just beginning to rise when they reached the cave's entrance. They geared up, each wearing headlamps, harnesses, and packs filled with supplies, before descending into the Devil's Throat. They navigated the tight passages and steep drops, but as they ventured deeper, the cave began to reveal its true nature. The passages grew narrower, and the rock surface was filled with moisture. The adventure became an uneasy tension as the cave seemed to close in around them. After a long descent, they reached a narrow passage that John believed would lead to a deeper chamber. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through and angled sharply downward. John went first, wriggling through the constricting space. Peter followed, then Jensen, with Kevin bringing up the rear. About halfway through the passage, their worst nightmare happened. John had made it through, but Peter, who was right behind him, suddenly let out a gasp of pain. The narrow passage had taken an unexpected twist, and Peter had gotten stuck in a tilted position, his body wedged between 2 sharp rocks. His legs were twisted awkwardly beneath him, and his torso was contorted, pressing painfully against the unyielding stone. At first, Peter tried to move, to twist his body free, but every attempt sent searing pain through his back and legs. He could feel the sharp edges of the rocks digging into his flesh, the pressure growing unbearable. The narrow passage offered no room to maneuver, and every movement seemed to wedge him in tighter. The pain was excruciating, like knives stabbing into his lower back and legs. John, realizing something was wrong, called back to Peter. The response was a cry of pain. John immediately crawled back toward the narrow passage, trying to reach his friend, but the confined space made it impossible to help. Jensen and Kevin, still behind Peter, were equally helpless. The walls of the passage pressed in from all sides, making it impossible for them to assist. The group was trapped, Peter pinned and John stuck behind him, unable to push forward or retreat. The reality of their situation began to sink in. There was no quick way out, no immediate help on the horizon. Kevin and Jensen finally decide to get help before it gets too late, leaving John and Peter behind. They made it to the surface, their minds racing as they considered their options. They were miles from the nearest town, and any official rescue team would take hours, if not days, to reach them. They knew they couldn't wait. Jensen and Kevin ran through the forest insight of the locals who well knew the mountains and their secrets. They explained to the locals about their dire situation, which needed an immediate plan of action. The locals decided to divide into two groups, one that'd get in contact with the rescue teams, while the other composed of self-taught skilled cavers who would try to get Peter and John out. They gathered tools and rushed towards the cave and made the descent. By the time they reached the narrow passage, Peter was in a state of agony. Locals assessed the situation and realized Peter's body was wedged so tightly that any attempt to free him could cause further injury, or worse. They tried everything, chipping away at the rock using makeshift levers to create space, but nothing worked. Eventually, Peter's strength began to fade and he gave in. The rescue teams eventually did arrive, but it was too late. It took them nearly a full day to extract Peter's body from the cave. In this story, the people involved did not allow their names to be published. On 24th January 2011, 4 young adults from the Johns Hopkins Outdoor Club, 2 men and 2 women, decided to explore Schetromph Cave. Their goal was to assess its potential for future club outings. They entered the cave around 2:30 p.m., excitement buzzing among them as they navigated the dark, twisting passages. The exploration went well until tragedy struck. As they began their exit, one of the young men found himself facing a particularly tight and challenging section of the cave. To get out, he had to go headfirst through a narrow, hourglass-shaped passage. This passage then made a sharp 90-degree turn before narrowing even further into a body-sized wormhole, ominously known as the corkscrew. With a mix of determination and caution, he approached the narrow passage on his hands and knees. But as he lowered himself into the pit headfirst, he misjudged his grip. Before he could adjust, his left leg folded against his chest in a painful, fetal-like position. The unforgiving rock walls pinched around him, trapping him at the tightest part of the hourglass, completely upside down with his head resting on the cold, hard ground. Panic set in quickly. His female companions, though brave and determined, were unable to pull him free. They tried to lift him, but their strength wasn't enough, and they couldn't get the right leverage. After 20 agonizing minutes, they realized they needed help. One of them scrambled out of the cave and called 911. Trapped upside down in the narrow, suffocating passage, the young man felt the relentless pressure of the rock walls squeezing his chest and compressing his limbs. His left leg, twisted painfully against his torso, throbbed with a dull, relentless ache. But it was the sensation in his head that truly terrified him. Blood pooled and rushed to his skull, creating an unbearable pressure that made his vision blur and his thoughts swim. The pounding in his head was like a hammer striking from within, each beat of his heart sending a fresh wave of excruciating pain through his temples. He could feel the blood vessels straining, as if they were on the verge of bursting, while a fiery, searing pain radiated from his neck down his spine. As the rescue was initiated, a local resident heard the call over a scanner and immediately contacted his friend, Jerry Bowen, an experienced caver. Jerry and his son, Stephen, quickly drove to the site, their minds racing with the possibilities of what they might face. On arrival, they met with the deputy fire chief of the Mogginsville Goodwill Volunteer Fire Department. Despite neither Jerry nor Stephen having been inside Schetromph Cave before, the fire chief was convinced they could help. No one else on the scene was small enough to reach the trapped caver. Stephen, being the smaller of the two, was chosen to go in. He was equipped with water, hearing protection, eye protection, an air quality meter, a compressed air tank, and an air chisel. One of the women, who had emerged with a camera to show the trapped man's predicament, volunteered to guide Stephen back into the cave, carrying supplies. When Stephen finally reached the trapped caver, they found themselves face to face. The man was lodged so tightly that Stephen couldn't get past him. He handed the bag of supplies to one of the man's friends, who carefully offered the trapped caver some water. Stephen then went back for the air tank. Once back, Stephen began chiseling away at the rock, his heart pounding as he tried not to injure the trapped man. The work was slow and nerve-wracking. At one point, they had to call for a steel plate to shield the man from the chisel. When Stephen returned with the plate and a fresh tank, He found the situation had worsened. The trapped caver had slipped further down, making it even harder to access the rock. But Stephen wasn't ready to give up. With the man's friend pulling from above and Stephen pushing from below, they managed to get him into a slightly better position. Stephen resumed chiseling, carefully removing the final rock projection. With a collective push and pull, the man's leg finally popped free of the constriction. The moment the radio crackled with the news of his release, a wave of relief washed over everyone. The freed caver, exhausted and shaken, drank some water and rested briefly before beginning the slow, painful journey back to the entrance. As they neared the exit, 2 confined space rescue professionals met them to assist with a 15-foot climb. He was flown to a hospital for evaluation, but miraculously, he had no serious injuries. In April 1991, 40-year-old Emily Davis Mobley, an experienced caver with a passion for exploration, set out on an expedition to map the uncharted sections of Lechuguilla Cave in New Mexico. The expedition began like any other, with Emily and her team descending into the cave, navigating through tight spaces, jagged rocks, and steep drops. The atmosphere was filled with excitement and the promise of discovery. The cave's beauty was breathtaking. As they ventured deeper, the terrain became increasingly challenging. The air grew thinner, and the narrow passages became more constricting. After hours of strenuous exploration, the team reached a particularly remote section of the cave, rarely visited due to its difficulty. The allure of the unknown spurred them on. Emily led the way, squeezing through a narrow passage barely wide enough for her body. The walls pressed against her as she inched forward, her helmet scraping against the ceiling. Suddenly, as she tried to maneuver through an even tighter spot, she placed her hand on a massive boulder to push herself up. But the boulder, loosened by years of dripping water, suddenly slipped and came crashing down on her leg, pinning it in a crevice with a sickening thud. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Emily's leg was trapped, and every attempt to free herself only made it worse. The unyielding stone bit into her flesh, sending waves of excruciating pain through her body. Her breathing became rapid and shallow as panic set in. Her team quickly realized something had gone wrong and rushed to move the massive boulder crushing her leg. The pain was almost too much to bear. The doctor and her team splinted her leg, but now the pressing question was how to get her out of this dire situation. A message was sent to the surface, and soon a full-scale rescue operation was launched. News of the incident spread, and over 200 rescuers, including some of the best cavers and medical professionals in the country, converged on Lechuguilla Cave. Rescuers had to navigate the same tight passages, carrying heavy equipment and medical supplies. The sharp rocks and steep drops made every step dangerous, and the deeper they went, the harder it became to communicate with those on the surface. When the first rescuers finally reached Emily, they worked with extreme care, knowing that any wrong move could worsen her condition. They used ropes and pulleys to slowly and painstakingly move her from one area to another and then lift her up. They were 2 miles deep in the earth. By then, Emily had bravely regained her composure. Although she had participated in several rescue missions, this was the first time she was being rescued. As one of the most experienced cavers, she ended up leading her own rescue, instructing the team on how to get her out. Remarkably, she even found humor in the situation, requesting pizza as she was starving. Emily had to be carried out of the cave, a task that would take days. The rescuers fashioned a makeshift stretcher and began the arduous journey back to the surface. They had to navigate the same narrow passages, steep climbs, and vertical shafts, all while ensuring her safety. After 3 days of relentless effort, the team finally approached the cave's entrance. The last stretch was the hardest, an almost vertical climb that required precise coordination. With every ounce of strength they had left, the rescuers slowly and carefully lifted Emily out of the cave. Emily was awake for 30 hours during the final stages of her evacuation, which culminated in her emergence from the cave around 12:15 a.m. She was immediately taken to a hospital, where doctors treated her injuries. Despite suffering severe trauma to her leg, she survived against all odds.
Imagine it. Turkeys roasting, laughter fills the air, family gathered close for the holidays. It's supposed to be a time of joy, of creating memories that last a lifetime. But for the Jones family, one Thanksgiving in 2009, those memories would take a horrifying turn. They planned a fun adventure, not knowing it would lead to unimaginable darkness and heartbreaking loss. This is the story of the Nutty Putty Cave tragedy, a tale of exploration gone wrong, of bravery tested, and a reminder of the hidden dangers that lurk beneath the surface. John Jones, eager for family fun, joined the expedition. While he hadn't explored this particular cave before, John and his brother Josh had a history of caving in various Utah caves during their youth. Despite his experience, John's cave explorations had taken a backseat in recent years due to the demands of marriage, fatherhood, and his pursuit of a medical degree at the University of Virginia. With the Thanksgiving break providing a respite, John looked forward to relaxing with his family through a day of hiking and exploring at Nutty Putty. Nutty Putty Cave, with its diverse and captivating sections, offered explorers a range of experiences. The maze room, characterized by openings and tunnels around substantial boulders, provided a fascinating network to navigate. Another notable area was the slide, a large ramped section where the entire room sloped at a 45-degree angle. The birth canal, with its tight and constricting passage, posed a formidable challenge. Similarly, the aorta crawl tested adventurers' skills with its difficult-to-pass tunnels. Nutty Putty had recently reopened to the public. To address the risks, a new permit system was implemented, requiring 2 experienced cavers per group. Little did the Jones family know that their holiday adventure would take a devastating turn due to the unforgiving nature of the cave. On the Tuesday before Thanksgiving in 2009, Josh obtained a permit for a group of 11 family and friends, including John, who was eager for an adventurous day with his loved ones. Leaving behind his pregnant wife, Emily, and their 1-year-old daughter, Lizzie, for a relaxing evening, John, along with his brother Josh, ventured into the main open cave sections. Seeking a more challenging experience, they set out to explore the birth canal, a renowned tight passage with a particularly constricting squeeze near the end. Despite the potential panic-inducing nature, both experienced cavers took on the challenge, navigating through a small tunnel that undulated up and down. Over the next 10 feet, they encountered outcroppings of rocks and tight squeezes, requiring intricate twists of the body to progress. Named the corkscrew, this area demanded small and flexible cavers to maneuver through its panic-inducing contortions. Beyond the corkscrew, the passage angled up for another 5 feet before turning down over a rock ledge with a sharp 90-degree bend to the left. Reflecting on past challenges, they recalled the tale of Brock Clark, a 16-year-old boy who got wedged in the corkscrew section 5 years earlier, requiring 14 hours of rescue efforts. John found himself in the exact spot where Brock had struggled, realizing that, at 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, turning around in this confined space was not an option. Undeterred, he pressed forward, squeezing over the ledge area that no one else had crossed before. The only grim mistake he did was going head first, something that expert cavers strongly recommend not to do when entering unknown sections. In uncharted territory, John remained composed, convinced that an opening lay ahead. Believing he was navigating the birth canal, he pushed through tight zones, eventually sliding headfirst in a downward angle. Although he couldn't turn around, John, in his 12-inch high space, pressed forward, navigating the unknown with determination and composure. As gravity relentlessly pulled John's body downward, his strength waned, and he urgently called out to his brother Josh. Advising Josh not to follow him but to retreat, they deliberated on the best course of action. Realizing that attempting to move forward and turn around was their most viable option, John, collapsing onto his shoulders and head, needed to make a move to escape this precarious vertical position. In the dim light of his headlamp, he spotted a hole in the floor ahead, igniting a glimmer of hope that they might laugh about this misadventure over Thanksgiving dinner. Determined, he made a slight turn and headed towards the hole. The precise circumstances that led John into this tunnel hole remained unknown. It was speculated that he might have slipped, hit his head, and became wedged in the tight space. Alternatively, it was considered that he looked into the hole, but misjudged it as an opening rather than a dead end. Regardless, John found himself wedged nearly completely upside down at a 70-degree angle in a narrow opening, just 18 inches by 10 inches. John's attempts to push himself upwards from this confining hole proved exhausting. His arms were pinned, one folded under his chest and the other trapped by his side on a rock. Straining against the walls, he realized that his efforts were futile. His calves and feet were free in the passage above, but his legs were wedged on the narrowest side of the hole, only 8 inches wide. Yelling for Josh again, John's distressed cries signaled the severity of his predicament. Josh, returning to the tight space and traversing the corkscrew path feet first, was met with an alarming sight. In a series of futile attempts, Josh tried to grip and pull John up, while John pushed from his end. Exhausted and frustrated, the brothers acknowledged the gravity of the situation, realizing professional help was imperative. As the hours passed and gravity tightened its grip on John's exhausted body, John, with his shallow breaths, tried to stay calm while professional help arrived. The first cave rescuer, Susie Matta, navigated through the corkscrew area with relative ease due to her 5 feet 3 inches stature. Ropes tied to her ankles as a precaution, she checked on John's well-being and assured him that they were working to free him. Susie meticulously tied webbing straps around John's legs, feeding them back to the pit where the tunnel began. Numerous attempts were made to pull on the ropes and leverage John back up and out of the fissure. However, the friction on the ropes proved overwhelming, leaving John still pinned without the use of his arms for assistance. After exploring various options and considering aggressive approaches, the decision was reached to employ a pulley system to lift John up and out. Having successfully used a pulley system in a similar situation 5 years prior with Brock Clark, the rescuers knew it was a viable strategy. However, the challenging location made the task complex. Each piece of equipment had to be carefully transported from the entrance, taking nearly an hour to reach the other side of the corkscrew. The tunnel's tight dimensions allowed only smaller power tools to be carried in and out, and only one person, preferably small or wiry, could effectively assist at a time. Despite these challenges, the rescuers worked diligently to install each pulley, a time-consuming process. In the dark cave, John, who is a strong believer, found comfort in praying and singing. Hanging upside down all night took a toll on his body. Our bodies are not built to be upside down for too long. The blood flow, which normally goes down from the heart, struggled against gravity. This caused fluid to build up in John's lungs, making it hard for him to breathe. His muscles, not used to this position, got really tired. John's breathing slowed, and he became visibly spent. During this challenging time, a wired telecom system was brought down to John's location, allowing his wife to speak with him. Encouraging him to hang on and stay faithful, she received John's assurances that he would soon be reunited with her. It wasn't until 4 p.m. the next day that the pulleys were finally in place to attempt John's extraction. Ryan Schertz, inside the tunnel, helped maneuver John, whose body had settled into the narrow side of the opening. With each heave from the team outside, John moved inch by inch up and out of the hole. By this time, John's legs were in excruciating pain, having endured hours of pressure from the tied rope. Each tug prompted John to call for a stop, his nerves hypersensitive in this critical moment. They paused to give John a moment to gather himself, then tried again. It seemed to be working. John was finally being pulled up out of the hole, raised enough for Ryan to make actual eye contact with him. They passed down a tube for him to drink Gatorade. The effort was painstakingly slow, and exhaustion loomed over all involved. Ryan, squeezed in a tunnel just 12 inches high with his head near John's legs, worked diligently to maneuver him out of the tight 10-inch fissure. While progress was being made in lifting him up, they encountered a new challenge. John's legs were hitting the low ceiling above the tunnel, and twisting them into the passage proved impossible. After 19 hours upside down, without his help to delicately bend his knees to the side, the rescuers were contemplating the drastic measure of breaking his legs to facilitate his return into the passage. Time was running out for John, and a critical decision needed to be made. In a sudden and painful moment, Ryan blacked out. Upon regaining consciousness, he found himself bleeding heavily and confused. The rope holding the pulley to a natural arch section in the cave had broken, whipping the carabiner and pulley directly into Ryan's face. He suffered damage to his face, lip, and tongue, along with a concussion. The urgency to get out of the cave quickly set in. John was back where he started, completely wedged in the tunnel, with the circulation to his arms cut off and his legs unresponsive. This unfortunate incident marked the beginning of the end for John Jones. After Ryan was checked out and sent to the hospital, Dave took his place in the passage. Re-establishing the pulley lines took an hour, and Dave attempted to tie a rope around John's body. However, he couldn't get the rope past John's wedged torso. Throughout Dave's presence, John remained unresponsive. The entire operation depended on John's active participation for a successful rescue, and without it, the situation became increasingly dire. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Dave pushed himself back into the 12-inch tunnel. Exhausted, Brandon Coles took his place, bringing in the telecom system to allow John's family to communicate with him. Despite Emily's expressions of love and encouragement for John to take a break and rest, Brandon could see what she couldn't. John was no longer responsive, and no signs of life could be heard over the previous several hours. The rescue team gathered in the pit area inside the cave, discussing the somber reality. It was determined that a medical professional needed to confirm John's passing. A paramedic was sent into the tight section, and at 11:56 on Wednesday, November 25th, John Jones was pronounced dead. Despite the tireless efforts of the rescue teams working for 24 hours straight, John couldn't be freed due to his upside-down position. The clock was ticking, and time ran out. John survived an extraordinary 27 hours in an inverted position, 3 times longer than what was predicted as possible. The 6 rescue personnel who reached John in that rocky prison were truly heroic. They willingly placed themselves in a portion of the cave with many known risks, displayed selflessness in their efforts, maintained a calm demeanor, and never gave up on a seemingly impossible rescue. After realizing that recovering the body was impossible, John was left to rest in the Ed's Push section of the Nutty Putty cave for eternity. The entire cave system was closed off with concrete, never to be explored again. A plaque was placed there to commemorate the life of John Jones.
Floyd Collins was an experienced caver who had spent countless hours exploring the depths of Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. He was known for his fearlessness and expertise in navigating the treacherous passages of the cave. It was on a cold winter's day in 1925 that Floyd set out on his most daring adventure yet. Armed with little more than a lantern and a spirit of adventure, he ventured into the heart of Sand Cave as a solo explorer, a cave filled with tunnels and chambers hidden beneath the surface of the earth. As Floyd made his way deeper into the cave, he felt a sense of excitement wash over him. The air was cool and damp, the walls slick with moisture, and the darkness enveloped him like a shroud. But Floyd was undeterred, his eyes fixed on the prize that lay ahead. As Collins made his way deeper into the cave, he encountered a narrow crawlway that he had never seen before. Despite his initial hesitation, he decided to push forward, squeezing through the tight passage with ease. And then, without warning, disaster struck. As Floyd crawled through the passage, a massive rock suddenly dislodged from the cave ceiling, crashing down and trapping his leg beneath its weight. In an instant, Floyd went from fearless explorer to helpless victim, his cries for help echoing through the darkness. Panic began to set in, as Collins realized the gravity of his situation. He was alone, with no one to help him, and no way to communicate with the outside world. As the hours ticked by, Collins' situation grew increasingly dire. He was running out of air, and he was going through excruciating pain. Despite his efforts to free himself, he was unable to move, and his hopes of rescue began to dwindle. Above ground, Floyd's absence did not go unnoticed. Collins' friends and family were growing concerned. They had expected him to return by nightfall, but as the hours passed, there was no sign of him. Soon, word spread throughout the community about the trapped cave explorer. A sense of urgency gripped the town, and a massive rescue effort was launched to free Floyd from his rocky prison. The terrain was treacherous, the passages narrow and winding, and progress was slow. Despite the best efforts of the rescue teams, they struggled to reach Floyd's location, their hopes fading with each passing day. As the days turned into weeks, Floyd remained trapped in the darkness, his situation growing more desperate by the hour. He fought against the pain and the fear, clinging to the hope that help would soon arrive. But deep down, he knew that his time was running out. As the search party continued their search, they began to realize the magnitude of Collins' mistake. He had underestimated the difficulty of the cave and had ventured too far in without proper equipment or support. They knew that Collins was inexperienced, but they also knew that even the most experienced ones can make mistakes. As the hours turned into days, the search party grew more desperate. They had found no sign of Collins, and they were beginning to lose hope, but they refused to give up, knowing that Collins was still out there, waiting to be found. Finally, the search party found Collins's body, wedged in the narrow crawlway with a huge boulder trapping his legs. After nearly 2 weeks of being trapped in the cave, Floyd Collins succumbed to his injuries and passed away alone in the darkness. His death sent shockwaves through the community and sparked a national conversation about the risks of cave exploration.
On February 12, 2011, as winter loosened its grip but the cold still lingered, 10 students from the University of Florida decided to explore Ellison's cave. Leading the group was Grant Lackenbach, a 20-year-old excited for his upcoming birthday. Grant and his buddy Michael, along with other adventure-loving friends, often sought thrills together, whether climbing rocks or diving into caves. Their destination was Ellison's cave, a massive underground wonder nestled in Georgia's Pigeon Mountain. With its depths plunging over 1,000 feet and boasting the jaw-dropping fantastic pit, this cave promised an unforgettable adventure. Despite the long journey of over 400 miles, their excitement knew no bounds. Arriving in Georgia the day before, they settled into a hotel near Pigeon Mountain. The next morning, they eagerly packed their caving gear into their cars, ready for the climb. They left their phones behind, never expecting the importance they would later hold. They were wearing shorts and t-shirts, and not dressed appropriately for the weather of the most technical caves in the United States. As they ascended the mountain, the chill in the air reminded them that winter hadn't quite released its grip. Sadly, they hadn't dressed warmly enough for the journey. Grant and Michael, accustomed to cave exploration, didn't think much of it. But as they approached Ellison's cave, a narrow entrance greeted them, hinting at the mysteries within. With excitement and a bit of nervousness, they entered the cave, their headlamps revealing its hidden wonders. Yet, the cold reminded them of the season's bite. They planned only a short exploration, unaware of the danger lurking ahead. One student's backpack fell into a vertical pit known as the warm-up pit. This one is not as deep as the Fantastic Pit, at only 125 feet, but it was still dangerous. The temperatures were unusually cold due to a waterfall nearby that screamed like a lion and cooled like Antarctica. It was not a place anyone should attend, especially someone dressed as these students were. But the backpack included some necessary supplies for the group, and they didn't intend to spend much time down there. It would only be a quick drop to get the luggage before heading out again. Grant, the group's leader, volunteered to grab the bag. His pals advised him not to risk it, and to simply leave the bag since they sensed something horrible was about to happen. But he refused to listen, insisting that he would be okay. So they tapped him on the back and wished him luck as he attempted to lower himself down the pit using a rope. Grant carefully rappelled down the abyss for a good distance before shivering slightly as the cold worsened. But he hadn't seen the worst of it yet. As he got closer to the bottom, the sound of a nearby rushing waterfall became increasingly audible. He could still hear his friends talking and reassuring him. He had gotten halfway down when something dreadful happened. As he descended, Grant came face to face with the crying waterfall. Already shaking, he tried not to let the frigid water touch him. However, in his attempt, the worst occurred first. He noticed a loud jolting sound coming from his harness and rope. He had stopped moving because he was shivering. Panic quickly filled his veins, so he began jolting with his rope and harness, hoping to get it to work again. However, his endeavor simply resulted in the rope wrapping around him deeper. Then his biggest nightmare came true. As he struggled to free himself from the entanglement, the ice-cold water showered him. By this point, he was shouting at the top of his lungs for aid. His shouts were muted and strangled by the roaring waterfall and his shivering mouth. Nevertheless, his friends heard him and responded. They all stared at each other, puzzled and concerned. But Michael did not hesitate to use the same rope that his friend had used to descend in order to save him. He pleaded for him to sit tight. He quickly approached Grant, who had become slow and unintelligible in speech and movement, save for acute shivering and confusion. He was weary and could only fumble with his hands. Michael had to scream to update his friends above about the situation, who were mildly relieved but unsure what would happen next. As Michael attempted the rescue, he became further entangled in the rope. His body became the victim of the same chilly water that had already brought his friend on the verge of death. Recognizing that he too couldn't travel up or down the rope, Now both of them were entangled and battling with their lives as the freezing cold waterfall kept pouring at them, sucking their souls out. The ones that stayed continued communicating with the boys below, giving them words of encouragement. They prayed for and assured them that help was on the way. Those who made it out started descending the mountain with all the strength they could muster, and in less than 30 minutes, they were at its floor, with hands shaking and eyes blurry. They retrieved their phones from the car and promptly contacted the authorities. It was already 2:19 p.m. In the cave, Michael and Grant's voices were fading as the cold gnawed at them. Above ground, their friends feared the worst, urging them to hold on while help was on the way. The bitter cold drained their energy, their bodies struggling to withstand the frigid temperatures. Despite communicating with their friends for about 30 minutes, Michael and Grant's voices fell silent. Their friends were distraught to see the rope they had used dangling loosely. After some time, the other friends returned with the county's cave-in cliff rescue team. While some of the team tended to the other 8 students, offering treatment for hypothermia, the rest swiftly descended into the pit. There, they discovered Michael and Grant hanging from the rope. By 3:30 p.m., they checked for pulses but found none. It was too late. They relayed their grim discovery to those above, and the cave echoed with sorrowful cries as the group tried to comfort the grieving students. The rescuers encountered a significant challenge as they tried to free the boys from the entangled rope, a task as daunting as Michael's own heroic efforts. Even with their experience and equipment, it proved difficult to pry their bodies loose. However, equipped with proper attire and rescue tools, they persevered. Their tireless efforts stretched on for 6 grueling hours, not culminating until around 10 p.m., when they finally managed to release the boys from their perilous predicament and hoist them up the pit. Upon seeing Michael and Grant, their friends succumbed to another wave of emotional anguish. On October 28, 2004, diver Dave Shaw went into a deep hole in Bozeman, known as Bushman's Hole, with a goal to break diving records. He successfully reached a depth of 270 meters, breaking records on a rebreather, in a cave, at altitude, and running on a line. His dive lasted nearly 10 hours. After achieving his goals, Dave decided to come back up. However, just before he started to ascend, he saw something that changed his life forever: the body of Dion Dreyer. Bushman's Hole, discovered in 1977 by diver Mike Rathborn, is a natural sinkhole on Mount Carmel Farm. It's filled with fresh water and is believed to be very old. The cave is about 283 meters deep, making it one of the deepest freshwater caves globally. To enter, you have to climb down a steep rock to the water surface. Dion Dreyer, from South Africa, loved going diving. Before 1994, he went on more than 200 recreational dives. He was a bit of a daredevil, inspired by the stories of other divers. In 1994, he got invited to join some divers from the South African Cave Diving Association to explore Bushman's Hole during the holidays. He was very excited about this opportunity. They planned to dive about 150 meters, and everything was set for the dive. However, just 2 weeks before the planned dive, Dreyer's grandfather passed away. After the funeral service, Dreyer sat around a campfire with his family, thinking about life. It was during this reflection that he made a profound statement. His father, Theo, recalls Dreyer saying that if he had a choice of how to go out in life, he would like to go out diving. On December 17, 1994, Dion, along with his fellow divers, went for a practice dive in Bushman's Hole. Nuno Gomez had assembled the team and set conditions for a technical deep dive later in the week. The entire team descended into the dark water, explored the area, and then gathered for a head count. The problem was that Dion was missing. The team searched everywhere for Dion, but couldn't find him. They had to return to the surface to ensure their own safety. The 20-year-old Dion Dreyer was gone. The team agreed that he likely went missing during his ascent, around 50 meters from the surface. The consensus was that he might have lost consciousness or experienced hypercapnia due to breathing too heavily at that depth. Dion Dreyer's father, Theo, decided to use a remote-controlled submarine from the De Beers Mining Company to help find his son. The submarine searched underwater for some time but didn't find Dion's body. They did discover something unusual: Dion's dive helmet on the seafloor. However, his body was still missing. After 2 weeks of searching, Dion Dreyer was presumed dead. Fast forward to October 28, 2004. 892 feet below the surface, Australian diver David John Shaw made an unexpected discovery. Dave found Dion Dreyer's remains, a collection of bones inside a diving suit. He tried to move the body, but it was embedded in the silt. Dave, after a few attempts, realized that he is unable to continue due to low oxygen, so he returned to the surface, profoundly impacted by what he saw. After a 10-hour dive, Dave surfaced and shared with Dion's parents, Theo and Marie, the unbelievable news that he had found their son's body in Bushman's hole. Despite their initial disbelief, Dave assured them he would return to recover Dion's body. The challenging task of retrieval involved Dave and another diver, Don Shirley, planning the deepest underwater recovery in history. Over the next 3 weeks, Dave crafted a master plan for the daring recovery mission, assembling a team of seasoned support divers with nerves of steel. Their mission: to plunge into the icy depths, checking on Dave's well-being at various intervals during his ascent. Concerned about the fragility of Dion's body, the team opted to use a bag for the recovery. 2 days before the final dive, the team gathered, and Dave, unfamiliar with a new helmet camera, received instructions. On the day of the dive, they assembled, and each team member was assigned specific roles. Dave's responsibility was to bring Dion's body from the deep. Prioritizing safety, Dave openly instructed the team not to jeopardize their lives for the sake of body recovery. Privately, he and Don agreed on a signal with flashlights if they needed assistance in the depths. On January 8, 2005, as the clock struck 6 a.m., Dave, Shirley, and the team descended upon the sinkhole. Equipped with determination, they donned their gear, and Dave prepared to document the unfolding events. Dave dived to 886 feet, where he found Dion's body earlier. His plan was to put the body in a bag and bring it to a depth of 725 feet, where Don would assist with a 10-hour decompression before reaching the surface. The chilling encounter unfolded as Dave attached the body tag and grappled to fit the remains into a body bag. A twist occurred as the lifeless Dion Dreyer began to float, transformed into a soapy substance known as adipocere, a bizarre fusion of crumbly wax and saturated fatty acids. As Dave worked with both hands, he was forced to put his torch down on the cave floor. This light was connected to a heavy battery canister through a wire, usually worn on the diver's waist. Typically, Dave would have had the wire behind his neck, but in a lapse of judgment, he didn't do so. The team outside waited anxiously but saw no sign of the recovery team emerging with Dion's body. Van Schaik, part of the team, realized something went wrong, causing the delay. Still unsure of the situation, they waited. Don, who was waiting about 700 feet below the surface, became concerned when Dave didn't appear. He noticed no bubbles, and a distant light wasn't moving. When a diver is in distress, they wave their torch to alert their support team. When Don descended 14 minutes after Shaw's departure, he expected to see a flashing light indicating Shaw's coordinates. However, he only saw the beam from the light in a stagnant position, no movement. Something was wrong. Worried about Dave facing depth-related issues, Don descended to help. Don dove past what he had initially expected, about 800 feet below the surface. As he continued to swim, he heard a loud crack. His breathing apparatus had been broken. Don knew he had to pump in more oxygen to the gas mixture, but at that depth, it would only put his life at risk. Despite not knowing Dave's current state, he began to rise to the surface but passed out from a helium bubble in his ear. He went in and out of consciousness, unsure of his orientation. Miraculously found by a support diver, Don's life hung in the balance. The team, holding their breath, nursed him back to consciousness, ensuring that he made it out alive. Yet, the drama didn't end there. The uncertainty echoed, demanding answers. Where was Dave Shaw? Don told them that Dave couldn't come up, and he had been left down there. A rescue operation started immediately. They got support from the authorities. The dive team descended once more to retrieve Dave. In a surreal twist, they found not just Dion Dreyer, but also the lifeless body of Dave Shaw. Upon closer inspection, it was a tragic revelation. The lines from the body bag had become entangled with Dave's torch. His efforts to free himself from the clutches lead him to his unfortunate farewell. Dave sacrificed his life in an attempt to offer closure to a grieving family, uncertain whether they would ever lay eyes on their child's remains. In the end, deep underwater at Bushman's Hole, a story unfolded that mixed discovery with great sadness. Dave promised to bring back Dion's body, But the dangerous mission took Dave's life, too. The underwater world, full of secrets and dangers, became the setting for a special story of bravery and loss. Looking back on this intense journey into the deep, we appreciate the dedication that led these divers to explore the unknown, the strong friendship that supported their efforts, and the courage that made them challenge the mysteries below. In the silent depths of Bushman's Hole, Dave and Dion faced their biggest test and found a final resting place, forever linked by the brave spirit of those who venture where few have gone before.